My first thing is, have you ever had an important conversation that you were anxious or worried about? And then it actually goes really, really badly anyway. You felt too passionate, or you felt too stubborn, deferential, or stressed, busy, or whatever it was. But it's more than likely that at some point in your life or your career, you've had a conversation like that and you felt those feelings in that conversation. But conversely, I'm sure there have been times when you've had a great conversation. It's all been aligned, it's in flow, you've got rapport, you're completely relaxed. So when you think about those two situations, what made the difference? Our communication and our behavior is the external vocalization of our physiological demonstration of which is our body language, but it's the externalization of the thinking and the feeling. So if you think about an iceberg, you've got underneath, everything is our values, our beliefs, our emotions, our thoughts. But what people see is the tip of the iceberg, and that's actually your behavior. So below the surface is what we're thinking and what we're feeling. And those thoughts and feelings are actually driving our behavior. But no one else sees what goes on beneath, only we do. They only have meaning to us. But that meaning in a split second drives our behavior, good or bad, and actually comes to the surface, covering us in glory or not. So when we're thinking about our feelings and they're aligned with other people, we actually connect. We can build rapport, we feel safe, we feel secure, and it's actually great. But when we're not aligned, and it's usually when something's at stake, so it's an important conversation, or it's got a big impact, or it really, really means something to you, then that's actually what is called a crucial conversation. There's a book all about it. But these conversations trigger our emotional responses of fight or flight. So I'm sure everyone's heard of fight or flight responses at the moment, but this is what causes it. So it's that emotional belief, values, and everything that's going on underneath the surface. So that actually manifests in terms of our behavior as silence or violence. And what that means is we either withdraw in terms of silence, or we become defensive or aggressive. Has that ever happened? Neither are actually a really good recipe for you for connection or communication. You may have heard it called a visceral response. It's just an extreme reaction to an emotion. So you're having a conversation, there's a trigger, it triggers our emotions internally, and then it comes out in our behavior. And today we're going to talk about emotional intelligence, how our emotions can hijack us in a communication whilst we're having connection with others, and what we need to be aware of in order to be able to navigate through that and get the best results we can. So we've known IQ for years and years and years, and that's how we've measured intelligence as stuff. But this new kid on the block, emotional intelligence, like skepticism in the workplace, because, you know, historically you didn't bring emotions into the workplace. They stayed at home. We don't talk about what we feel. But post-COVID and in the world that we live in now, it's so relevant and really needed. So actually it's a step as leadership from good leadership to great leadership. When we talk about EQ, what do we mean by it exactly? For me, EQ is the optimal space where our logical thinking and our emotive feelings meet and blend to provide an optimum performance, so our optimum behavior. It allows us from that trigger of the conversation in terms of our emotional response, our logical thinking coming into that behavior. The knowledge of emotional intelligence allows us to slow that transaction down, that whole chain reaction by, you know, stepping back, pausing, breathing, and being able to navigate through. But I want you to think about the fact that we face this all the time. You know, we go about our daily lives, we have triggers, we have patterns, but it's only when we think about it that actually we can navigate through with emotional intelligence.
Because it's one of the biggest things I coach on at the minute, and it's around reconnection to the emotion. Because as kids, most of us are taught to suppress our emotions. You know, you fall over and you're crying and you're told, no, you're okay, brush it off, you're fine. And so from a really young age, we're taught to suppress emotion. And then as we get older, all that suppression builds up. And then we start to work out there's these triggers. Then the trigger happens and sometimes we explode. However we respond, and we surprise ourselves with, wow, where did that come from? What actually fueled that particular thing? One of the first things I say when I coach people is when you are triggered, you need to learn how to create that space between stimulus and response. Anything you say after you create that space is going to be better than what you would have said right at that point in time. Because right at that point in time is like when the child pulls the dog's tail, the dog turns around and the dog snaps, because that's what it instinctively does. And
Absolutely.
That's what we do. Now, that doesn't help as a leader. If that's the way you operate and that's the way you behave, you've got a china plate. You drop a china plate a few times and sure, you can glue it back together. But after a while, that china plate isn't going to go back together the same way. And that's the analogy I use to kind of show if you don't learn to control your emotions, then what you're doing is you're snapping, you're creating that fractured wound in between a relationship, which is really hard to then try and motivate. If you don't have psychological trust, which is what you were alluding to earlier, then that connection isn't there. So since we're talking all about communication and connection, your job is to create the psychological trust, which has preservation of relationship first and foremost at the front of it. And then you've got to manage the emotion along the way. And these are the crucial conversations I'm having with people that I coach, because they've never thought about how important their emotions are and how much they impact who they are.
And also it's about not really recognizing what the emotions are that we're feeling, because as you said, as a child we've been told this, we've been told that, and it becomes our standard operating mode, and we don't question it because, well, our role models, our parents, the people around us told us that this would benefit us, and so therefore that's what we do. And so when we're thinking about that iceberg and we're saying, okay, these are our values, these are our beliefs that are within, we don't actually realize or take the time to look at what those values and beliefs are, and actually, are they our beliefs? So when I coach people, we actually look at, okay, so what beliefs do you hold? And they say this and this and this, and say, what makes you believe that? Oh, it's what my mum told me, or what my teacher told me. So do you still believe that? And when you actually question someone's beliefs, so many of them, oh no, that belongs to my teacher. Oh no, that belongs to my mother, or, so we don't ever take the time to go deeper, and understanding our emotions and our values and everything is so beneficial to us, because then it explains why we behave the way that we do. And you also mentioned a couple of words there. You said, manage our emotions, control our emotions. I'd go one step further and say, when you manage or control, there's still that sense of constriction. So that's why we talk about navigating the journey of your emotions, so that actually you're not denying them. They're there, they're present, but you're accepting, and then you're working through them. The question is, why focus on emotional intelligence now? Sam and I have just kind of depicted a little bit for you there in terms of, why is it important? It's always been important. It just hasn't necessarily been as prevalent or relevant in the world as it is today. We're living in what we call a Vuca world, and many of you may have heard of this. It's a volatile, uncertain, complex and ambiguous world that we're living in. So what that means is that there is constant change that we're having to face. And constant change, some people can think, great, embrace it. I love change, I love doing things differently. And some people can think, oh my God, my life's in turmoil. There's always something different going on. So the changes in the world that are going on at the moment, we've got environmental changes, we've got female empowerment, we've got, managing millennials and Z Gen. And it's so different from having their directive or their expectations of the workplace and of leaders is so different from previous generations. We've got the rise of the social enterprise. We've got COVID. So these are obviously impacting socio-economic and political and businesses. But from a personal level, it's also really affecting the people that we live with and the people that we work with. The reason it's so important to have emotional intelligence now as a leader is because we've got evidence to show that connection is so important. One of the biggest things that people have faced from COVID is that loss of human connection. And that's actually caused a lack of motivation. It's caused boredom, disengagement. Homeworking has caused frustration through not knowing whether we do BAU or whether we do this whole new working thing. There are blurred boundaries. So as a leader working with your team, with your employees, you've got to recognise the physical effects that the COVID situation has caused, but also the mental attachment that goes with those physical effects. And you want to re-engage your team. You want to talk through their resentment, their frustration, so that you can come out the other side and actually know that you have got connection and trust with them, that you can build rapport, that you're there to support mental health with them. And all of these things, in the light of the pandemic, emotional intelligence has shown how much it can support us in facilitating our capacity for resilience, for motivation, empathy, reasoning, stress management, communication. And all of these things are obviously so important. I mean, the list goes on. So I say, why focus on it? But with all of the positivity around emotional intelligence, why wouldn't you focus on it? What's now more readily known, I guess, from COVID is, connection is the biggest word I feel that people are using when I'm talking about post-COVID situations. And I think since COVID, connection is needed as sort of the core, the foundation in leadership since that time. And if any of you want to do any further reading, Daniel Goleman actually popularized emotional intelligence. He wrote a book called Emotional Intelligence, and he dialogued it as critical skills plus behavioral traits that allow for strengthened leadership performance. So if you can have those two things that accelerate your leadership performance, why wouldn't you? Okay. So there's also a growing body of evidence, in addition to all of the literature out there, there is evidence that those with higher emotional intelligence, it's a predictor for leadership success. All the top leaders, when they're assessed on their emotional intelligence, they all have high emotional intelligence. That's not the case with IQ. So a leader can be the most intelligent person in the room, but without a high EQ score, this leader may fail to motivate themselves, but also their teams. And that's not what we want from leaders.
And I think that's a nice segue also to sort of say EQ isn't dependent on your position. However, as Bibi has said, the more successful leaders do have a higher EQ. I could be at the bottom of the rung in terms of where I sit on the org chart, but still have the highest level of emotional intelligence out of anyone in an organisation. The good thing is you can continue to grow it, unlike IQ, which is pretty static. EQ, you can continue to develop. And you mentioned something before, Bibi, and when I do training now, I'll inevitably have people say, oh my goodness, Sam, when can we actually get some work done around here? I find myself having conversations with my team like I'm their dad, or I'm talking about political things I never would have spoken about, or medical things I never would have spoken about previously. And so it's that understanding, getting people to say, okay, well, first of all, it's about if that's what's on that person's mind at the minute, you've got to sit with it. If they're upset about the fact their budgie bird has died or something else has happened, then you have to acknowledge that, okay? You have to empathise with that and you have to sit with it. But you have to treat every conversation like a traffic light. If you're getting a red light, that's not time to power through and have that critical conversation you're trying to have. If you're getting an orange light, that means proceed with caution. If you're getting a green light, then sure, move forward. But until you've actually addressed what that person's concerned in, there's a fair chance they've switched off anyway. They're not really focusing on what you need them to focus on because they're emotionally invested in the thing that they need. And so, yes, at times you probably are going to have to handle your employees with kid gloves and have conversations that you otherwise never would have normally had with somebody pre-COVID.
And statistics have proven that an engaged workforce is going to be more productive, and productivity, leads to profitability. And at the end of the day, what a business is there for, they're there to make money. But if you can do that through a human-centric organisation now and leadership style, then obviously that's going to value for yourself more. You'll get more out of that relationship. It might be a struggle if you're more task focused rather than you are relational focused. It's going to be a struggle to start off with, being able to sit down and just have a conversation. It might not seem like work, but if your engaged workforce actually works harder for you, then actually it still is work. There was a global survey done a few years ago. And obviously with cultural differences, people have different motivations culturally as well, depending on sort of the level of development of the country and everything. But universally, the one top thing that came out in the top three across the globe for engagement was, I like it when my manager takes the time to know me. And I think that's quite telling. If that's how people get engaged globally, then why wouldn't we pay attention to it?